Good morning, everyone. Welcome to the Climate Governance Initiative's Global Summit 2022 with the theme Ambition to Action. Climate Governance Malaysia is the Secretariat for the ASEAN Climate Governance Network, which is supported by all institutes of directors in the region. And we have curated a series of 4 sessions for this 24-hour Global Summit. This is the first session curated by the ASEAN Climate Governance Network. Zero Ambitions, what is the role of boards on climate? The Climate Governance Initiative mobilizes boards of directors around the world to address climate change in their businesses, building on the World Economic Forum's principles for effective governance. This network now comprises 24 chapters in 56 countries. The climate crisis is informed by science, and as an existential crisis, throwing up significant risks and opportunities, all directors need to be climate literate. To discuss Zero Ambitions, we are delighted to have a great lineup for you today. We will start with a short welcome note by Karina Litvack, founder and chairperson of the Climate Governance Initiative, followed by 2 keynote speakers, Professor Dr. Skea, IPCC Working Group 3 co-chair, Professor Dr. Djisman Simandjuntak, Rector of Universitas Prasetiya, Mulya, Chairman of the Board of Directors of CSIS Foundation, co-founder IICD and former trustee and IICD Fellow of Indonesia. We will then have a panel session moderated by Michele, Kythe, CEO, Institute of Corporate Directors, Malaysia, and panelists Jamie Allen, Secretary General, Asian Corporate Governance Association, Hong Kong, Stephen Miller, President and Group CEO, ST Telemedia, Singapore, Amar Gill, Managing Director and Head of Investment Stewardship, Asia Pacific, BlackRock, Hong Kong. And we will then close with one final interview with Charlie Penner, former Head of Active Engagement, Engine Number 1. All sessions are recorded, so you will have access to these recordings. Enjoy this session. Karina, okay. It's such a pleasure to have you with us today and to give the welcome note for this session. So the first question I'm going to ask you is a really tough one. Why is Asia important to you?
Well, Asia is important to us, not just to me. Asia is the fastest growing region in the planet. It is where we have the greatest opportunities to realize an effective climate transition with the adoption of new technologies, with the opportunity to leapfrog and learn from the errors that Europe and North America have made before them. So this is why all eyes must be on Asia. It's also a part of the world that is extraordinarily exposed, as we've seen with Pakistan recently, and not only with Pakistan. And we know that this COP27 in Sharm el-Sheikh is going to be a tense one because the subject of loss and damage is going to come up. The subject of historical responsibility is going to come up and can no longer be sidelined. So for all these reasons, Asia is going to be at the top of the agenda.
Front and center, I couldn't agree more. What do businesses and boards of directors in this part of the world need to realize urgently?
Well, the first thing they need to realize is that it's their job. It's not just government's job, it's an all of society job, right? So government cannot fix this on its own, business cannot fix this on its own, but we as directors must pick up the reins and we must really drive this. Because if we don't, it simply won't happen at the pace and on the scale that is required.
Yeah, that's spot on. What do you see as the best practices of climate governance which directors could take on board? What are your thoughts?
You know, in an ideal world, you have a board chair who really understands the urgency of this challenge and is leading and inspiring the board and leading and inspiring the staff, but also reaching out externally and engaging with policymakers, civil society, customers, suppliers, the whole ecosystem. In the absence of that, because the world is not perfect, we as directors need to bring that about. And so there are any number of actions that we can take to, to prompt our fellow directors, our chairs, our CEOs to grasp the seriousness of this challenge, take it on, and run with it.
Thank you so much. It's always such a pleasure having you around. This is a very short note, but is there any other closing remark that you'd like to leave us with? This is being the Global Summit for Climate Governance Initiative.
This is the Global Summit. It's just in the run-up to COP27. Let's make sure that we as directors fully understand the responsibility and the opportunity that we have. Let's make the best of what we can with the takeaways from COP. There will be some successes and there will be inevitably some disappointments, and we must not let that stop us. We really have to push on, and there will be more COPs to come, and this is going to be a long haul and a very, very hard job.
Karina Litvack, Chairman of Climate Governance Initiative, thank you so much for spending time with us today. Take care.
Thank you, Sunita. Always a pleasure.
Good morning, good afternoon, or good evening. And thank you for this opportunity to say a few words to the Climate Governance Initiative. And just in a couple of minutes, I'll run quickly through what science is telling us about action to deal with the complex issue of climate change. In the last year or so, all of the 3 IPCC working groups have produced reports. And Working Group 1 on the physical science made it quite clear that human beings are unequivocally the cause of the climate change that we're all observing at the moment. Our colleagues in Working Group 2, who look at impacts, adaptation and vulnerability, have drawn attention to the fact that we can already observe the effects of climate change, both on natural systems and human systems. We can see it in terms of floods. We can see it in terms of loss of marine life. We can see it in terms of forest fires around the world, things that people can really observe and relate to. And these changes can only get worse unless we do something about climate change. For example, we could see deteriorations in crop yields, or much greater loss of species and loss of human infrastructures in cities and elsewhere. Now, I come from Working Group 3 that looks at mitigation or the challenges of reducing emissions. And we've clearly sent out the message that to stop climate change, global emissions will have to reach net zero during the second half or close to the middle of the 21st century. And it is a little sign of optimism, I think, when we want to inject a message of hope into the picture, that many countries have now adopted net zero targets. But what we have at the moment is a gap, and it's not an emissions gap in terms of net zero pledges, it's an implementation gap instead in terms of seeing the kind of measures taking place on the ground that would allow these net zero pledges to be met. So we still just have the possibility of limiting warming to 1.5 degrees, but these opportunities will go unless we take dramatic action and really take it rather quickly. So we have, in the Working Group 3 report on mitigation, tried to send out a little bit of a message of hope, because we can see things changing. We've seen the cost of renewable energy and the take-up of renewables falling. We have seen the adoption of climate laws and measures all around the world, albeit they still have to have an effect. But looking forward, what we absolutely need to do to limit the worst effects of climate change, we need action across all sectors of the economy. We need to transform the energy system with a particular emphasis on the role of renewable energy. In demand sectors like transportation, we need efficiency, but we also need a move to different forms of energy, and particularly a move from oil-fired transport with internal combustion engines through to electrification. And that will allow us to take advantage of low to zero carbon electricity. Buildings in many parts of the world can be made much more efficient, And future cities can be designed in different ways to take advantage of green infrastructure, more use of trees, etc., and blue infrastructure, filling cities with more water that help us cool down, as well as helping us reduce energy requirements. And in the industrial sector, we do see the prospect, albeit in the much longer term, of getting to net zero emissions from some of the bigger challenging processes in steel and cement. And finally, we do need to face up to the issue that we will need to remove carbon dioxide from the atmosphere to compensate for particularly difficult sectors. And this can be done in through so-called nature-based solutions to a greater extent than IPCC has considered so far. So things like planting trees, very obviously, but also agricultural practices that build up carbon in soils, again helping with both adapt and mitigate climate change. So just to finish off, I think the human race is not in an easy situation here, but we do have the chance to make a big difference. And we would like to say in Working Group 3 that the glass is half full and half empty. So what we need to do in terms of ambitious climate policies is make the glass full. We need to fill it up to the top. And I'm sure you and your colleagues in the business sector are ready to work towards that ambition. So thank you very much, and very best wishes for the conference you're about to have.
We're so Professor Djisman,
Yes.
we're waiting for you to start.
Datin.
We're waiting for you.
All right.
Yeah, thank you.
Good morning, friends from here, Jakarta. It's really an honor for me to be with this event, and also for IICD, of which I was co-founder back in the late 1990s. We need to move on always. That's the nature of business. We now are faced with very fundamental issues. And I would like to draw your attention to reports by IPCC, and Karina just touched upon a few very basic issues, but also IPSP, International Panel on Social Progress, also under the United Nations system. And IPSP introduced this term fundamental resetting. So it's not my word, it's from the IPSP report 2018. And this resetting is needed because of climate change, because of losses in biodiversity, because of increasing inequality despite SDG 2030, because of shifting geoeconomy in favor of Asia. And I think Karina mentioned this also. Asia is very important in dealing with climate change. We are here, China, India, and Indonesia, three of the most populous countries in the world, and three major emitters of carbon dioxide. And unless something happens in our part of the world, it is hard to imagine that progress will be made to achieve net zero emission 2050. And it is also very important to bear in mind that business, I think, plays a central role in both mitigation and adaptation. Governments have agreed on a number of basic agreements like the Paris Agreement, or a number of agreements also in regard to biodiversity. So it's not agreements gap, to quote Jean. It is action gap on the side of business, and action gap because of, I think, awareness gap is also still there. Awareness gap because of knowledge gap. And even if awareness is there, we have to deal with technology gap. We are imprisoned in past technologies. Imagine the very big petrochemical complexes. Imagine electricity generating plants. And we are doomed to live with them for a long time. And the question then becomes very difficult. And business, again, is of centrality in all this. I think governments have done their part. It's now the turn of business to do their part. That's why my first bullet is strategic internalization. Internalization. That was also the term we used when we founded IICD Indonesia. Internalizing good practices of corporate governance. We know that there is no big bang in mitigation and adaptation. We will have to go the evolutionary way. But once again, even an evolution can be accelerated somewhat with the help of technology. And foremost, I think, on corporate agenda should be creating awareness. And creating awareness requires good information. That's why companies, enterprises need to exercise in quantifying carbon footprints, not only within each of the companies, but along the value chain. It makes it difficult because a particular part of the value chain may not be very polluting or not carbon intensive, but probably upstream there may be huge emission of carbon dioxide. So we have to do this along the value chains rather than individually at the firm level. And this data on footprints is very important. It is a requirement to draw an evidence-based corporate agenda, enterprise roadmap. I think we companies can do a lot of things on our side, such as minimizing material consumption for every unit of needs. The OECD reported that we are now consuming 80 gigaton materials every year, 80 billion tons. Each of us consumes 10 metric tons of materials every year. And it is estimated to increase to around 170 gigaton by 2060. With such material consumption, it is hard to imagine to arrive to net zero emission, whether it is 2050 or 2060. But once again, roadmap at the corporate level is very important. Now, we need to create momentum, resetting momentum, turning away from carbon-intensive business into carbon-less intensive businesses, creating momentum. And I think at this stage, boards can play a very important role. Boards can contribute a lot. At Indotambang, which is a coal mining, where I serve as president commissioner, we in Indonesia have two board systems. So we call it Board of Commissioners, Supervisory Board. We try a lot to, one, generate enough knowledge about good governance and sustainable development. I overheard the discussion on how board can be instrumental to climate change mitigation and adaptation. At the company where I serve as commissioner, we put sustainable development and governance together as one committee. And this committee reports to the Board of Commissioners, to the supervisory board. We also have SD days. Every year we organize sustainable development days. We have innovation days where climate change is taken up increasingly. And we also have a director, member of the board of directors, dealing with sustainable development. And within sustainable development, of course, climate agenda is core. And creating and sustaining this resetting momentum can be done in many ways. In the end, I think, as in the case of good corporate governance, making climate awareness, making mitigation and adaptation a culture within the company is key. It's not enough that we have documents. It's not enough that we have roadmap. Making it a culture is very important. And as I said, this is not going to happen at once. It's going to be evolutionary. And as in the case of governance also, evolutionary stable strategy is going to be very important. How do we organize ourselves in favor of climate change agenda in favor of net zero emission and in favor of circular economy and the likes, I think is important. In the case of good corporate governance, we have the ASEAN scorecard. And I would like to see also we in the region cooperate on climate scorecard. I know it's going to be difficult because our knowledge of climate change is still very limited. Of course, IPCC supplies to us tons of materials, but internalizing those materials will take time. And I think this scorecard should be considered among us. So we would be having one governance scorecard and secondly, climate scorecard. And we should reach out to ASEAN corporation, whether it is local or multinational, to be supportive of this idea, making ASEAN a kind of one of attractors in corporate mitigation and adaptation in regard to climate change. We have had a good experience with corporate governance. In the beginning, it was very difficult. When the crisis hit us in the late 1990s, it was hard to imagine that companies in the region would move to adopting good corporate governance. And I think today, despite of limitations, we can say that ASEAN companies have somehow managed to internalize good corporate governance. And I hope that in a not too distant future, ASEAN companies, whether it is local, regional, or multinational, will be an important player in leading us into a world where climate change becomes an everyday part of life, or mitigation and adaptation. And ICD Indonesia would be happy to be part of this cooperation. And with this, I wish you all the best. Once again, let me underline, for us in business, but also for academia, the question is, how do we internalize all the agreements that our governments have signed, whether it is on climate change, on biodiversity, on circular economy, as well as on inclusive development, reducing inequality. They all come together. Even though perhaps we can place climate change at the core, but they all need to be addressed simultaneously. Datin, with this, I would like to end my message, and I wish us in ASEAN great success in bringing this agenda into corporate level, into the boards of companies in our part of the world. Thank you very much and good day.
Thank you, Prof. Djisman and ICD for that. Good morning, everyone. Thank you for joining us this morning on a very actually wet morning in Kuala Lumpur today. I have with me the three gentlemen. As you would know, we've got Jamie from a governance oversight, to give us his perspectives. Stephen Miller from the corporate side in Singapore. And we've got Amar, who's finally got his background up. Amar from Hong Kong, to give us his investor's perspective. I think we've seen from the speakers before us this morning the focus really on beyond ambition now, beyond awareness now to action, right? I think that's important, and who, and we mentioned it as well in our Directors Summit recently, to act now. Now, who is to act now? Where we're focusing this morning, obviously in this session, on boards and corporates, and what the responsibilities are now. We've seen this marked shift, in terms of policymakers, regulations, and therefore the increasing pressure on boards and corporates to now deliver on their plans and roadmap on this climate transition. So without further ado, we have about 50 minutes this morning, about 35 minutes on the panel and sum up, as well as around 15 minutes for the Q&A. So please do post your Q&A questions in the Q&A tab and not the chat tab. Thank you. We will start off, I think, with looking at legal implications for boards. Now, recently, we did launch at the Directors Summit, the Internet Institute of Corporate Directors Malaysia's International Director Summit, the legal opinion on directors' duties and disclosure obligations under Malaysian law in the context of climate change risks and considerations. Now, perhaps similarly to other countries in the region as well, it is apparent that legal and regulatory developments in terms of that directors are duty bound. Now, there's no question about that. Directors are duty bound to proactively and urgently apprise themselves on climate change and how that affects their company. So there's no question about it. There is a responsibility and accountability on boards. Now, how they do this is something we want to discuss this morning in terms of managing resources, risks, and the actions that they would take, right? It's moved on now from an ethical and environmental issue to one that has clear financial, systemic risks, as well as opportunities. Now, I will go into the first questions, which I will address to Jamie. Jamie, in terms of legal implications, what are some of the strategic options directors can take in managing these climate risks? Options such as emission reduction targets, for example, and how can they take advantage of these opportunities as well, on the other hand?
Thanks, Michele. I think the first thing I would say is that directors and companies don't need to reinvent the wheel here in terms of thinking through climate risk and from a strategic perspective. I mean, there are some useful frameworks. There's the World Economic Forum framework, of course. There's the TCFD framework. And there's also a lot of work being done by companies around the region and around the world. So there's a lot of good examples that companies can study. So you really don't need to reinvent the wheel here. But I thought I would take the TCFD framework, partly because it's short. But I think the first thing is companies, they do need to think about their governance. What is the proper structure at the board level for discussing climate risk and opportunity? What sort of board committee do they need? Do they need a specialized committee? And we're going to talk more about that later. But it's really important to emphasize the role of management here, because management, of course, is there full time in the company, in the sense that they are clearly a major part of the engine room for thinking through these strategic issues. And you need to have the right people in management, but also you need to have the right structure in management. And again, there's a lot of good examples from around the region about how management teams are structuring themselves and working with boards on governance. Coming to the second point on strategy, it's an issue of really thinking through at the board and management level, what are the most material risks facing your company? How do you address those over the short, medium, and long term? It's not just a long-term issue. There's, obviously a lot of short-term issues as well, particularly from physical risks of climate change. But boards need to be, thinking through these issues and also thinking about, well, are there new commercial opportunities that they can benefit from in terms of products or services or new ways of doing what they're doing today? So again, lots of examples around the region about how boards are thinking this through. In terms of risk management, Stephen will talk more about this, but again, it's bringing climate risk issues into your risk management framework. One interesting example here from a company in Australia is they run toll roads, and what they're developing for major assets is what they call the CRAMP, C-R-A-M-P. It's Climate Risk and Adaptation Management Program for major assets. So really thinking through, what are the different impacts, again, using things like scenario analysis, what are the different impacts that different climate change outcomes will have on different assets, and what is the plan that they're going to put in place to adapt. And then just lastly on metrics and targets, everyone likes talking about net zero to 2050, but that's an awfully long way away. Most of us will either be dead or retired by then. I think what's more compelling to investors, and I'm sure Amar will touch on this, is really the interim targets to 2030. And a lot of companies are having, they do have targets, emission reduction targets and other targets to 2030, but it's critical those targets are relevant, that they're science-based. So the best practices is companies are getting their targets verified by the Science Based Targets Initiative. But it's also important to have a pathway to 2030. It's not enough just to say we're going to reduce emissions by 50%, which a lot of companies say, but that's great. But how are you going to get from here to there over the next 8 years? And, what are the interim targets between now and 2030? So, I think it's useful for companies to take the TCFD framework, also look at the World Economic Forum framework and really think through this strategically and in a very structured way. But again, there's lots of good examples out there companies can learn from. Thanks.
Thank you, Jamie. And Stephen, you can give us one example now with your own experience in strategy formulation, business planning, CAPEX, all of that, because we do understand it affects every single line almost of your account. So do give us your view.
Surely, I think Jamie gave a very good overview, and I think the only addition to that I would make is that you don't go from 0 to 100 in this development. This is a multi-year process, and both for the board and for the management, and I agree very much with Jamie there. It's an evolution in terms of skill sets, in terms of understanding, in terms of development. I think for strategy, it's becoming very apparent. So whether you're looking at M&A, whether you're looking at entering new lines of business, ESG incorporation into those assessments and analysis is critical. And so if you're looking at new geographies, new lines of business, then you need to understand what's available in those geographies. For example, in our data center business, we are entering new countries. One of our key criteria is the availability of renewable energy. And so that becomes very important, and it does very dramatically, as I think everyone is aware, even across the ASEAN structure, as to what you can avail yourself to. Equally, I think when we look at investment in companies that don't have an ESG strategy, we factor that into our assessment. What is it going to take to remediate? What best practices does our group apply that we can educate and waterfall down to these other companies? And I think, again, it comes back to a lot of the reliance that the board has is going to come back to management actually executing on this. And so, the development of management skills, management attention to this often gets overlooked. But unless you have not only the board focused on it, but you have very specific people and teams and management focused on it on a multi-skilled basis, then you're actually not going to achieve anything. So I think one of the big things that the board can do is actually look at the execution capability of management as you develop strategy.
Thank you, Stephen. Thank you. I'll move on. Thank you for that, Amar. Looking from your point of view, we've mentioned disclosure frameworks. I mean, Jamie's mentioned TCFD. From an investor's point of view, do you think these mandatory disclosure standards actually provide sufficient information? How are your portfolio companies really reporting the material risks, for example, and what steps do you recommend to them to take to comply with TCFD?
Thanks, Michele. Look, I think it's a good question, and the context, the backdrop is you have a lot of companies in this region where they look at regulations and disclosure requirements with a compliance mindset. What do they need to do satisfy the listing rules in the markets that they are listed. And so the risk is that the requirements of listing rules in markets may differ, and companies will take the lowest level of disclosures as what they need to provide. So really, I think there's a role for regulators to play as well. And that is where the new standards that are evolving, ISSB, which has 2 papers for consultations, which it just closed, and their standards should be finalized, by early next year. It's a very promising baseline of reporting requirements for sustainability that we hope the exchanges in across the world will adopt, so that companies are all starting to report on what is material, what's relevant for the business, and in a way that's comparable from one market to another for given sectors. And I think even before the regulators start to introduce these listing disclosure requirements, companies that want to show that they really are ahead on the sustainability challenges can start with TCFD. TCFD is up there, and the pillars of disclosure by TCFD make eminent sense, and it's essentially what international investors are looking at to see whether companies are taking these issues seriously. To address your question on what are the risks for companies, I think even for me, in looking at what is happening in the evolution of this space, the technology is evolving very, very quickly. My friend Jamie pointed out to me a few months ago that in the state of South Australia, 80% of the energy, the electricity, is now renewables. 80% is already renewables. So you need to have very capable batteries as backup. You need to have stable generation of renewables into the system, but it's getting there very quickly. And so the biggest risk for companies is that they are not keeping abreast with the new technologies that have become economically viable. And I think that is a big issue that boards as well as managements have to be always keeping tab of.
Thank you, Amar. Stephen, your experience, what are the best practices on incorporating or integrating climate-related risks into your risk management process?
I think, with some of our companies, so the group we have is telcos, data centers, and cloud services. And so, I think part of it is, for example, as we're moving from on the telco space, which people can understand is as you go from 3G to 4G and now 5G, one of the unintended consequences of 5G is a very large increase in power consumption. The way that the radio network works for 5G, it often has multiple antenna arrays on one site. Now that's great in terms of the consumer experience, in terms of the technical standards and capabilities, but your operating system just went up in terms of power consumption. So when we looked at in the various telcos we have, looking at that, we also then had to address simultaneously, how do we start to offset, through efficiencies, through operating systems, how do we offset that increase in generating power consumption? And that can be more focused local targeting. It can mean turning off certain cell sites, at 3 a.m. for a few hours because you don't need the capacity in that area. So when we look at these, changes in evolution in the technology capabilities, such as Amar was saying, you also simultaneously have to look at the implications for climate and also how do you more efficiently operate. I think we, on the data center side, there's very much an understanding that, if we are to maintain a social license to operate, we have to be fully committed to renewable energy. And we have to develop that on a platform basis. Now, different geographies have different capabilities. Singapore, there's virtually no capability just due to land size to generate renewable energy. So how do we look at that from a corporate strategy point of view? The answer to that is we've got to take a sort of whole of Asia Pac or a whole of ASEAN approach, where I do think there is a very much emerging opportunities, nature-based solutions that were referred to, cross-border transmission of green electricity, and then potentially cross-border trading of verifiable RECs. So all of these things are now coming in parallel, simultaneously, rather than as an afterthought or as a consequence.
Thank you, Stephen. And I think it's important that we know, because we do know, that telcos, ONG, are huge contributors to carbon in that sense. But therefore, it's important to see your efforts at addressing this, and thank you for that. But again, to your point of 5G, not everyone's in that space, right? Singapore, maybe, perhaps. So perhaps targets, therefore, are quite individualized in that sense to different countries, different geographies, different industries. Sure. Jamie, I'm going to ask you about metrics and targets. How should all these be sort of translated into something meaningful so that and achievable? Bearing in mind, everyone's at a different maturity. We talked about 5G. Different countries are different, different industries are different. So how, meaningfully, how do they get there within their own space?
Well, I think, as I mentioned, having a meaningful target is not a sort of self-referential target saying I'm going to reduce by, my carbon emissions by 10% compared to last year. I mean, you need something that is aligned with the Paris Agreement, ideally, not just the 2 degree, but, the 1.5 degree. So, and then you need to, you probably need to bring in some consulting expertise to help you, develop the targets. Then you need to engage with the Science Based Target Initiative to have them validated. And that process takes time. So, we would encourage companies to sort of move on this sooner rather than later. And that's actually a general piece of advice I think it's worth thinking about is everybody is worried about how they're going to do this, but if you don't get started soon, it will take that much longer. And then that brings to the specific scope 1, scope 2, scope 3 targets. Most people are pretty comfortable getting scope 1 and 2 because, that's within their realm of operations. A lot of companies are very afraid of scope 3, like they're very afraid of scenario analysis. Again, I think, the companies we speak to, their advice is, look, you need to get going on this. You need to get a grip as quickly as you can. And there are different ways of, doing scope 3, which are more efficient than companies perhaps realize. And one interesting example there is a company we're looking at where they're trying to get a grip on the scope 3 emissions from their suppliers. So the upstream part of the value chain. And what they did is they worked with 50 of their largest suppliers, and they got those 50 suppliers to basically sign up to the Carbon Disclosure Project, CDP, and disclose to CDP. And then this company was able to essentially harvest all that data through CDP and get a really good idea of what the emissions from their top 50 suppliers were. And this is a company where their biggest emissions are actually in the scope 3 side. And many companies are in that sort of group. Their scope 1 and 2 emissions are often relatively limited, but their scope 3, either upstream or downstream, can be huge. So unless you get a grip on that and really work with your suppliers and also work with your customers, if where appropriate, you're never going to be able to really manage your scope 3. But so to make it meaningful, you do need to get the data. It takes time. It can take several years to really get on top of this. I'm sure Stephen can talk in much more detail about the pain. But again, I think it's, if you don't get started, you won't really have a sense of how to manage it effectively. So don't be put off. Don't be too afraid, I would say, of getting on this journey.
That's right. I mean, we're going on to that topic next about, there's no room for inaction. But again, I think what Jamie highlights here is that it is an all of society approach. You can't work alone. You need to work with all your suppliers. You probably need to work with your competitors to work on getting, for example, if you were wanting more green materials in a construction industry, best that everyone work together to try and get the suppliers to bring the cost down, etc. So things like that, and I think there's no time for inaction, really. Now I get on to my next topic. It also sort of, we've seen, and we've got engine number one coming on after this, but how they defeated ExxonMobil in election of directors, for example. So boards cannot not take action, as we've said, right? So again, going back to boards, Jamie, back to you again. Do we need a sustainability committee? Do we need a climate change director to sit on the board to action this? Yeah,
I think you need, just on the committees, I think you do need a committee looking in detail at sustainability. Whether it's a sustainability committee or not is a question I think each company needs to sort out. Certainly some companies are setting up sustainability committees at the board level and also at management level. And again, it's important not to forget what's happening at management, because management is running the company on a day-to-day basis. And as Stephen said, you really need the skills in management. It's not just the skills at the board level. But we've also seen other companies delegating this to their audit committee, or some companies have an audit and risk committee, or they may delegate it, say, to a risk committee. So I think companies need to decide what's best for them at this stage, and I'm sure this will evolve. But I think one of the key things is, if you're going to delegate it to an existing committee, does that committee actually have the skills and the time and the energy to really think through these issues properly? We're concerned that some companies are delegating climate and sustainability to their audit committees, and their audit committees already have a hugely long list of issues to sort of deal with. And then you look at the membership of that committee and you think, well, there's nobody here really who understands these issues. So do we need a climate change director? Actually, I think we would probably say no. What you need is all directors who have some degree of knowledge about climate. I think there's a danger in having overly specialized roles for different directors, because the obvious question is, well, if we need a climate change director, then boy, we better have a cyber risk director as well. And then somebody else will say, well, we better, have a climate accounting director. So I think it's really important that you have a range of skills at the board level, and that, that raises the question of training of directors. Also, the role of the nomination committee in making sure that you bring new people into the board that do have a sufficient level of sustainability knowledge. So, the board is collectively responsible. So I think it's potentially dangerous to sort of just think, well, we just appoint somebody who's a climate change specialist and then we can forget about it. That's not going to be a productive approach.
That's right. And Stephen, moving on from just the governance structure in terms of the action and the practical side of things, how would you advise companies to set their roadmap to setting those targets? We have quite a lot of companies in Malaysia, for example, asking about that.
Yeah, I think that, again, I would start that this is not, you don't go from 0 to 100, right? You've got to really, I think when we first start planning this out, capability development at both the director level and the management level, we identified was a 3-year process. And, as Jamie said, start with scope 1, scope 2, get the measurements underway, understand what you're contributing to GHG and other requirements. And they're the ones that you can directly impact. They're the ones that you can take direct action. And so I think, that is where you start. I think from a committee level point of view, we tend to favor having risk and sustainability as a good forum. I agree again with Jamie. I would not put it with audit or other committees. I think that doesn't serve the purpose. But then there is an important relationship between that committee and the management groups. And so we have people looking at financial risk, we have people looking at operating risk, but we also have specific people that focus completely on sustainability issues. And that is a cross-company function that looks at operation, that looks at planning, that looks at a lot of areas. So I think that that interaction is critical. And I think we're going to be building into scope 3. So I think as more and more companies with the right intent can publish their scope 1 and scope 2, then that interplay to scope 3 becomes easier and more transparent. So, the way we're focused on now is, or what we have done over the last couple of years, I think we have a very good handle on scope 1 and scope 2, and we're taking direct action on that, and we're sort of working into scope 3. We don't downplay the significance of scope 3, but scope 3 is obviously just logistically and informationally much more complex to get a comprehensive position put together. But, a phrase I used earlier, progress, not perfection. I don't think anyone's going to say they're perfect at this at the moment, but as long as the intent of the board is there and the intent of management is there, then, it's 2 steps forward and hopefully no steps back.
Yes, I like that. Progress, not perfection, slowly but surely, right?
Yeah, look, I mean, people are developing skills, even the advisors we use will tell us they have a good handle on this piece of it. But even the advisors that we use don't pretend that they know everything about everything. Right. And so, I think it's the amalgamation of knowledge and capabilities. It's not pretending that there's one repository of element of that. And, I think that reflects the, multiple disclosure standards that we're all grappling with. Right. This is an emerging point to best practice.
Yeah. And we talk about targets, we talk about roadmaps, but as part of that, in terms of measurement of progress to those targets, how do you include climate change in your balanced scorecards, as part of executive remuneration? Do you do that in your company?
Increasingly. So again, I wouldn't say we're at where we want to be, but again, you need to go through the measurement process and the target process first before it becomes a valid element of people's KPIs. I think that for certainly our telcos, who are probably further down this path than some other elements, they're at the point where management is comfortable being measured against those KPIs, and the board is comfortable setting the KPIs. So that goes into the REM committee, but interacts with the risk committee, risk and sustainability committee. So you need that interplay there. I would say, for example, on our data center side, we're probably a step behind there because we now have a good handle on what the metrics are. We're now at the stage where we're ready to start incorporating that into remuneration programs. And I think that, for basically holdcos or topcos, however you want to describe it, their scope 1, scope 2 are very limited, but we have different KPIs there, which is how, from a governance point of view, are we cascading or waterfalling the ESG requirements down through our operating companies. And so horses for courses, tailored to the situation. But, I think important that, A, the board is comfortable setting the KPIs, and B, that management is comfortable performing against them. And so, again, an iterative process, but, starts with good data.
Right. And just, again, flowing on from that topic, we've got some data, as we mentioned, that Climate Action 100 plus, 69% of focus companies have committed to achieve net zero emissions by 2050 or sooner. However, only 17% of focus companies have set medium-term emissions reduction targets aligned with, Paris Agreement 1.5 degrees. Therefore, setting goals without a plan is just a dream. And we talk about this, the ESG dream. Now, Stephen, do you agree then that the zero target ambition is something good to aspire to, good for the brand, but not necessarily foundation to a company strategy?
Well, I think the other element that, I would put on the table here in terms of stakeholder engagement is actually your employees, right? If you look at young employees, millennials, whatever, they want to work for companies that have these sorts of commitments. And so what encourages me and different directors, that there is actually a bottom-up element of a commitment to climate change, commitment to doing good purpose in this area. So if your board's not going to hold you accountable, your employees certainly will as well. I think so. Yes, I think there is help. It is valid to set the long-term ambition, but very clearly you have to come back. So if I'm 2050, where do I need to be by 2040? Where do I need to be by 2030? Where do I need to be in 2 years? So, the way we look at it is a walk back function as to not just one set of interim targets, but numerous sets of interim targets that get you on the way. I think that, I think a lot of management teams are now, hitting the aha moment is they've made statements, they've made commitments, and now it's execution time. And so I think that that is fairly stark in terms of, okay, next year, I need to improve my, power efficiency. I need to improve my water efficiency by another 10%. And, you have to take these improvements in increments. And that sort of rallies the mind, focuses the troops. And so, gets to a point where you can actually execute it. And again, it's a multidisciplinary approach to this. You're going to rely on your procurement teams. You're going to rely on your engineering teams. You're going to rely on your customer service teams as to how do you get a comprehensive, step-by-step approach over the next couple of years.
Thank you. And I'm looking at the time now. I'm going to address 2 points, one to Amar and then into, on ASEAN and then into the Say on climate before I sum up. We've got one question in the Q&A tab now. Do keep them coming. Amar, in terms of ASEAN and your experience, are boards taking this seriously? Is it going to be real and achievable in ASEAN, or just a nice to have but not a priority?
Look, I think there's been a sea change in the last 2 years. 2 years ago, we had to, BlackRock, as a major international investor, had to request our investee companies to start TCFD reporting. Yep. We had meetings with CFOs and IRs, and we had to push the topic of sustainability and what companies were doing on climate change and risks and opportunities. Now it's changed. Today, you would have sustainability committees, not just at the board level, but you would probably also have a head of sustainability at the management level, quite often reporting to the CEO. Yep. And having his own team in the various SBUs. And we have now companies inviting us to speak to their boards on what we think they should be doing. What are we looking for from our investee companies? And we're getting more and more independent directors into the conversation. So I think it has evolved quite a bit over the last couple of years. Going back to what I was saying earlier, much of it is driven by the regulators. Markets like Malaysia and Singapore, where the regulators are setting a higher benchmark. We see more of the companies also asking for more from their investors. But across the region, across ASEAN, there's been significant improvement over the last 2 years.
And what more needs to be done, Amar, in terms of whether it's on the competency side or on the regulation side? What more needs to be done?
Look, there's a lot that needs to be done, and Stephen and Jamie have been talking about management capabilities and what is realistic to expect of the companies. But if you focus on the boards, I think the single most important thing is that directors have to be asking the right questions, right? They have to ask the right questions of management, and to be asking the right questions, they have to be getting information and they have to consult outside of management as well. So board directors need to be discussing with consultants, experts on how the industry is evolving so that they are able to ask the right questions of management.
That's right. That's right. So it's competency and knowledge, right? They need to be able to be equipped to ask the right questions, right?
That's right.
Say on climate. I will ask all three of you what your views are on Say on climate. Because I think the Edelman survey, as we've mentioned, reported that nearly 3 out of 4 institutional investors do not trust companies to achieve their status as its sustainability goals. On the other hand, investors who lack the expertise and necessary resources may not be able to effectively scrutinize climate plans. Now, what are your views? I'll take you one by one on say on climate. We've had say on pay. We're now coming into this version of shareholders speaking up. I don't think all investors agree that it's a good thing. It's not meant to I think approve or disapprove a climate plan, but what is I'll start with you, Amar. Your say on climate does this help facilitate or perhaps prevent greenwashing, for example?
Look, I think it's a bit ad hoc. Some companies put this on their agenda. Not much in ASEAN. I can't remember seeing any ASEAN companies doing it, but you see it in Australia.
Oh, but I'll let the other two gentlemen speak about that. Yeah. You see
it in Australia and other parts of the world. And what they disclose, will differ from one company to another. I think, my personal view is it's useful for companies to get a sense of whether investors think that they're doing enough on climate. So it's kind of testing the waters, testing the temperature. But beyond that, I think what is more important is that you have real engagement by senior management and the board with the stakeholders, with the experts on how the technology is evolving, and with investors, so that in particular the board gets direct communication from investors of what the concerns investors have on the sector, and for the investors also to have direct communication from the board on how they're addressing the issues and how do they determine what are the right strategies for the company.
Jamie, your feedback on this.
I would agree with Amar that say on climate votes are certainly not a substitute for a good engagement by companies. But I have to say my view has become somewhat more positive about say on climate, partly because we've been covering governance for a long time, and there's always a risk that the market tries to bring a simple solution to what is a very complex problem. And I think that's what we saw in say on pay. And so, you're asking you're asking investors to vote on what the appropriate pay is, which leads to hugely long remuneration reports, leads to a huge amount of time spent by investors reading these reports. And at the end of the day, some investors will have the expertise to understand that information and some won't. So whether say on pay has really achieved its objectives, I'm not sure, but I'm actually more positive about say on climate because again, it's not a substitute for proper engagement and dialogue between companies and investors, but what we're seeing in Australia, and it's the only market where we're really seeing this in the region, is, it focuses the mind of companies. They are producing their TCFD reports. They're now calling their TCFD reports climate change reports. I think it's probably a catalyst for companies to do things more quickly. I think it is, also allowing investors to come up the learning curve more quickly in terms of, the granular detail of scope 2, scope 3, and other aspects of climate change disclosure. So I think broadly it's a positive trend. There's always an element that it's going to be a PR exercise by companies, but I think, companies who take that approach will be found out pretty quickly. I think investors, there's not just investors, there's lots of NGOs scrutinizing what's going on in Australia. So I don't think it's going to sort of lead to really greenwashing. I think on the contrary, actually, it will be broadly positive.
Stephen, in Singapore, any views?
Well, I think, and again, I would concur with Amar. I think what you've seen in Singapore over the last, certainly it started 4 or 5 years ago, but really the big impetus has really happened over the last 2 to 3 years, through government ministry, through SGX, through SID, the importance and the criticality, for something like Singapore, like the Maldives, like the Pacific Islands is not lost on anybody. And so I think it has focused the minds of directors and management. I think, the say on climate, I think to me comes back to the earlier reference, which is the board doing this because they fundamentally believe in it and therefore have the right intent and the right approach, or is it a compliance issue? And I think the companies that avail themselves to intent, probably will be applauded rather than scrutinized. I think it's the compliance approach that's going to get people in trouble. I think that, and I think, if you look at the inflows, into climate funds, is growing or has been increasing over the last 2 to 3 years. So I think there is money where the mouth is from investors as well. So you do see that translate into, green investing, green bond funds, etc. A lot of the banks are also applying the same sort of scrutiny. And I know that that's not say on climate, but even the banks are now got thresholds about what they'll accept and not accept. So I think all of that supports, a good intent. And, I think if companies don't want to be scrutinized under say on climate, then, the boards need to go from compliance to intent.
We have a question here from Dr. Ian Lowe. How do we move boards beyond compliance? Stephen? And you brought it up. Yeah.
I think it's very much a carrot and a stick approach. The stick is evident, but, I think that if you, for example, if you listen into the explanation of various fund managers as green fund managers and what they do and how they think about it, I think there's an opportunity set that's evident. And I think that, listening to companies, other companies, so not mine, but look at other companies as they've approached this topic, they very much take it from the opportunity, from an opportunity point of view. Let's reimagine our business. Let's reimagine how we organize ourselves. Let's reimagine how we procure. And yes, some of the green achievements may be modest in their individual circumstances, but just the sheer action of reviewing your core functionality, your core purpose, often leads to material improvements in underlying operations and capabilities. And so, I think there is a very noticeable and beneficial effect there. Again, from the finance side, if green financing, verifiable green financing is available, there's a carrot. I think one of the things that, personally that, we're looking at, which I think is going to be a big opportunity, and so changing a board mindset to intent, is the regionalization of some of these carbon issues. And so next week, Singapore and Australia Prime Ministers are meeting, and one of the things they'll be signing is a green economy agreement. So I think these sorts of initiatives that demonstrate opportunity, as a carrot to intent, rather than just relying on stick, is going to be critical.
Excellent. And Amar, a question from Saul Chambers. Do we have the time to not prioritize fast-tracking Scope 3 emission inventories? He does say we have had decades to measure GHG footprints, and progressive companies have well-developed decarbonization strategies already in play.
But I think we need to sequence the reporting of this, and the risk of requiring Scope 3 reporting immediately is if companies are providing information and data where their assumptions vary very much from one company to another, then it may not be comparable. The data may not be meaningful. So more important than Scope 3 data straight away is how the companies are thinking about what will be the sensible way of gauging their Scope 3 footprint. I think Scope 1 and Scope 2 is mandatory. And we at BlackRock are voting against companies in carbon-intensive sectors if they are not producing Scope 1, Scope 2 disclosures on their emissions and targets, long-term targets as well as medium-term targets. We're voting against carbon-intensive companies across the world, including APAC. Scope 3 is more. So Scope 1, Scope 2 we see as voting issues. Scope 3 we see as engagement issue with companies.
Yeah, I would agree with that.
Okay. Jamie, can you speak to the advances there are with attestation on the disclosure? I believe this probably talks about independent verification or assurance on disclosure.
Well, we're certainly seeing more of it, both from audit firms and specialist consulting firms who do verification attestation. But a general comment is that it's not moving as fast as it probably needs to. You know, we have done some research on this, and a lot of companies are not having their ESG or sustainability reports or climate reports assured. You know, we hear from auditors that they're somewhat frustrated about the standards that they need to use, the ISAE 3000 standards. You know, and there is a difference between those standards and the AA accountability standards. And there's also different approaches taken by auditors versus specialist, you know, attestation firms. So, you know, I think there's a real issue. There's a real need here to have some education and awareness building about what are the different options here, you know, what are the roles of the different assurers. But, you know, assurance, I think, really needs to move pretty quickly from being a voluntary exercise at the moment, which it is in pretty much every market, to becoming at least mandatory for you know, the larger, more exposed companies, the bigger emitters, say. And, you know, I think there's a need also for investors to be sort of engaging with companies around this more. I mean, there's a frustration on the investor side that, well, these assurance reports don't really tell us anything, which is true, because if you read one of these assurance reports at the end of an ESG report, it's a page, page and a half, 2 pages, very formulaic, often doesn't change from one year to the next. And investors don't get a lot of information out of that. So there is a need to find a way to make these reports more useful. Also, most assurance that's going on at the moment is limited assurance. And when we talk to companies, we say, why are you only doing limited assurance? They say, well, to be honest, there's really no pressure either from government or the market for reasonable high-level assurance. So we're going to go with limited. Plus, you know, there's a real issue with companies gathering the necessary data to provide for a higher level of assurance. And also companies say, well, to be honest, the cost is huge. And they're not entirely convinced that the CPA firms have the capacity and skills to actually do this work. So, and we know from audit firms that, you know, they're very worried about, you know, having the right level of capacity as well. So there's a huge amount of training that needs to go on the side of the audit and assurance industry. And all this leads to the International Sustainability Standards Board standards that will be coming out, which is, you know, clearly going to push assurance or a higher level of assurance. And, you know, we think that, you know, this does need to move as quickly as it can, but clearly there's a lot of capacity issues, cost issues, you know, other factors. It's I think, going to take some time before we have, you know, sustainability reports assured, you know, to anything like the level of financial statements.
Thank you. Thank you,
But I think you need to, also draw this area back to the previous one where, you know, when you're relying on other people for third-party information on scope 3, it's very difficult to, you know, for the company to attest, but equally for the audit firms also to attest. So I think scope 1 definitely needs to be verified. Scope 2, you're somewhere in between. I think how we deal with scope 3 on a limited or overview basis needs to be worked through. I don't think there's a clear conclusion around attestation for scope 3 at this point.
That's right. Well, as we can see, a lot of work is being done. A lot of it's still work in progress. But again, thank you, gentlemen. If I may sum up for today, I think we haven't got time to take any more questions. Apologies, Stephen, in the chat group, but I'll just do a quick sum up of what we've discussed today. Under legal implications, no need to reinvent the wheel. Everything is there. Material risks and commercial opportunities, both short and long term. Climate risk scenario planning and impacts, right? Companies need to look at that. 2050, too long away. Perhaps we should focus on 2030 to be more realistic, have a pathway or roadmap to that. Multi-year process, obviously skill sets or competence is important on board as well as management. Data, we talk about data, renewable energy as well. And obviously management working together with boards, right? So it's not just the boards. Disclosure, comparable data, you know, we've all talked about that. Scope 1, Scope 2 is a must-have. Scope 3, we're working on it in terms of engagement, in terms of assurance. The role of regulators and regulation needs to increase or continue. TCFD is a good start. Tech, which is evolving very quickly. That is the biggest risk. Perhaps companies need to look at that. Integrating risk as well, recognizing your social license to operate. Targets, make sure they're aligned as we talk about the Paris Agreement. No one size fits all, really. Everyone needs to internalize, do your risk-based analysis, look at where your gaps, your weaknesses are, and, slowly but surely, right? Work on that. But we all agree that we need to look at scope 3 and not just scope 1 and 2. Right, and perhaps working with, it's an all of industry, all of society approach, work with everyone, your competitors, your suppliers. Having a dedicated sustainability committee, skills at both the board and management level. We talked about this competency, climate competency that helps with focus, not necessarily just one climate competent director. Stephen said, it's not a 0 to 100 in terms of your roadmap. Start with scope 1 and 2, direct impact. And again, slowly but surely, but meaningfully, right? Progress, not perfection, in his words. Target and measurements before the KPIs. Obviously, there's a role there for your REMCOM. Do look at that. Assurance is not moving as fast as we would like it. Employees are important, right? Bottom up. Do set the long term, but do circle back again to the present. Sea of change in ASEAN, as Amar said, the needle is moving, but more NEDs are involved, driven a lot by the regulators. We know that, so there's good in terms of that. A lot more to be done. Competency and knowledge on boards, and asking the right questions. So you can't ask the right questions unless you're equipped, and you're only equipped if you have the right knowledge and competency. So knowledge is continuing, and that should be lifelong, right? And finally, say on climate, in terms of knowledge, if I will say this, in Malaysia, next year, we're coming up with the mandatory sustainability program. So everyone do look out for that. And PLCs in Malaysia, should sign up, but it's a one of a kind in the region. Do look out for that. We're running it, yes. Say on climate. Not much in ASEAN, but again, useful in terms of testing the waters, real engagement, more important, right, than just, doing the say on climate. It does help to focus minds, but not necessarily will it lead to greenwashing. So again, intent more important than just ticking the compliance box. So thank you, gentlemen. Thank you, everyone. I will now invite Charlie Penner, the former head of active engagement in engine number 1, to deliver the keynote address on investor climate activism. Thank you, everyone.
Thank you.
Thanks.
We're so pleased to have with us today Charlie Penner. In the middle of 2021, a small activist investment firm won a shocking victory at ExxonMobil. The firm's head of active engagement, Charlie Penner, had been making the case that America's most iconic oil company needed new directors to help it thrive in an era of mounting climate urgency. Well, Charlie, it's so good to have you here today. The first question that I have for you is, Asia is the factory for the world, keeping inflation down, with consumers outsourcing their carbon footprint and environmental destruction to this part of the world. What would you say to businesses, whether multinationals or those in the supply chain, who are betting against society succeeding?
Yeah, thank you for having me. It really is kind of the question, right? The way I think about it is, on a short-term basis, it's very difficult for even individual countries, much less the kind of global community, to address the challenges of climate change. But from a long-term perspective, particularly if you look at the changing economics of alternatives to a heavily carbonized economy, it makes sense to think that over the long term, those dynamics can change. I think that the crux of what you're talking about is capital allocation, good strategic decision making, involves taking account of risk. and companies that are failing to address these types of long-term risks that the global economy is more likely than not, I still think, to gradually decarbonize. You need board members, you need a strategy, you need a management team that's cognizant of those risks. You need the skill sets to be able to adequately address them.
So thank you, Charlie. So my next question for you is that you gained a foothold at the board of ExxonMobil based largely on the strength of your argument that failing to plan for the impact of climate change could spell the demise of a business, and these are the risks that you're talking about. But from a slightly different perspective, would you say that mitigating environmental harm is part of corporate responsibility? What are your thoughts on that?
Yeah, you know, having a discussion about any of these topics is so difficult these days because every term has kind of become so loaded, either by companies on the one hand, in my opinion, sometimes using terms more for the way they sound than whether or not they kind of accurately describe what a company is doing in the situation. And by the same token, I think that, you know, a lot of the, particularly as we've seen recently, kind of backlash to some of this terminology also kind of obfuscates, you know, the real kind of issues at play. I'm a firm believer that a company's values is to maximize, a company's mission is to maximize value for its investors. I'm also a firm believer, though, that companies that think long-term about environmental and social issues, including the negative impacts on the environment and society and workers and customers, will perform better over the long term. It gets back to that kind of short-term versus long-term you know, dynamic we were talking about. And I think that one of the things that's really difficult about the current debate is, again, you have people on both sides kind of ignoring certain parts of the equation as it kind of benefits their argument. So, you know, the equation is essentially that you have a short-term component, which is, you know, current kind of strategy and capital allocation. You have a long-term component, which is how do you plan for the future? And you have this massive risk of a changing climate and economics that favor an energy transition. So if you take out one part of the equation, like some people do, and ignore the realities of climate change and their economic impacts, like factory flooding and crop shortages and mass migrations that you know, from people seeking to avoid the worst impacts of climate change, then it's a really simple kind of question. You just say, well, who cares? Just keep on business as usual. By the same token, if you ignore the short-term part of the equation, which is we are still heavily dependent on the current kind of energy and manufacturing and construction infrastructure that we have today, and it's going to take time to make these changes, it also becomes really simple. You say, just walk away from everything now, and we walk directly into the future tomorrow. I think, unfortunately, we have a very complicated equation, but to your question about, you know, whether it's part of, you know, dealing with that entire equation as part of a company's responsibility, absolutely, because it's going to affect their long-term competitive positioning in the market.
Yeah. So before I get to my last question, which is why change directors versus changing the CEO management team, do you think you could just walk us through what your experience was at engine number one? And, you know, because it was a very compressed timeline, 6 months, you achieved something that was incredible, that's creating shockwaves around the world, which is really very, very new in Asia. Do you think you could just walk us through what the thought process was behind that?
Oh gosh, not in any coherent fashion. It was but I can tell you that the basic thought process was that you had a company that was really an outlier, even within the oil and gas industry, in terms of its performance for shareholders and in its approach to these kind of longer term risk factors that we've been talking about. And so the basic concept was, is you can make a compelling case to investors solely on an investor to investor level that change was needed. And so, you know, it's funny, the you know, campaign was portrayed as solely focused on kind of, you know, what's best for the planet, what's best for the world. And certainly, you know, those are important things, but, you know, to be successful, we had to make the arguments and I'm talking about when I was at engine number one, I'm not there anymore, but we had to make the arguments that even as a shareholder with the blinders on, if all you cared about was the long-term future of the company, they were just incorrectly positioned to address the kind of challenges of the future we've been talking about. With respect to why you change board members as opposed to the CEO, first of all, we didn't make the challenge that the CEO needed to be replaced. But secondly, in the U.S., at least in terms of what you can directly accomplish, we don't have management boards and executive boards. We just have the one board, and it's the board's responsibility to oversee the strategy of the company, and that includes choosing who the management team and the CEO of the company will be. So that's the direct option available to us. Our position was that the board of directors, other than the CEO, didn't have anyone with any energy experience, much less any kind of energy transition or transformative experience in the energy space. And so having that would actually be a benefit to the current CEO as he hopefully thinks about not just where the company is today, but where the company is going to be going in years to come.
Right. Okay. And your closing remarks, what would you say to directors across Asia? What should they be watching out for?
Oh my gosh, they should be listening to much smarter people than me. But with respect to the narrow things we've been talking about, I don't know how much of this, quite frankly, has permeated the debate in Asia, but unfortunately here in the US, people on both sides of the debate have tried to make this political or tried to make this concerns about topics like these are far-fetched or other kind of name-calling type things. And the reality is as I know and I'm sure people watching know, is climate change doesn't follow any party affiliation. The benefits to be had through the energy transition, including cheaper, more reliable, less kind of geopolitically fraught sources of energy, follow any party affiliation. So my hope is still that over time that gets recognized, and a lot of the kind of labeling and name calling and kind of political stuff gets tossed to the side. So I don't know how applicable that is in other parts of the world, but it's certainly happening here, and I hope that as I'm sure they will, folks in Asia keep their heads screwed on straight and focus on what matters.
Charlie Penner, thank you so much for your time. Delighted to hear from you. Look forward to catching up with you again soon. Take care.
Thank you.
Bye.